Close your eyes and let your mind drift back through the mists of time to an England where white roses and red roses bloomed in ancient gardens, their petals scattered by winds that carried the whispers of kings and queens long turned to dust. Tonight, we journey together through one of history's most captivating chapters, the Wars of the Roses, a 30-year tapestry woven from ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and ultimately the birth of a new world. Picture yourself walking through the ruins of medieval castles, where ivy now grows through windows that once framed the faces of Plantagenet princes. Feel the cool English mist on your skin as we explore battlefields returned to peaceful farmland, where sheep now graze over ground that once echoed with the clash of steel and the cries of men fighting for crowns that would outlast them all. This is a story of human struggle played out on history's grandest stage, where mighty dynasties rose and fell like the turning of seasons, where ordinary people lived extraordinary lives, and where the wheel of fortune spun endlessly between triumph and tragedy. As we walk together through these distant centuries, let their ancient dramas soothe your modern worries, offering the gentle perspective that only time can bring. Please share in the comments which historical period brings you the most peace, and subscribe for more restful journeys through time. Let us begin where all great stories do, with the seeds of change taking root in ordinary soil. In the golden autumn of 1327, when leaves fell like scattered coins across the courtyards of Windsor Castle, King Edward III sat upon the throne of England with the confidence of a man who believed his bloodline would rule forever. The Plantagenet dynasty had already governed England for 2 centuries, their lion banners flying from the windswept coasts of Cornwall to the misty borders of Scotland, and Edward's court glittered with a magnificence that seemed to promise eternal stability. Imagine walking through the great halls of his palace on a winter evening where hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on tapestried walls, depicting the heroic deeds of Arthur and his knights. The air would be thick with the scent of roasted meat and mulled wine, alive with the laughter of nobles dressed in silk and velvet, their jewelled fingers catching the firelight as they raised their goblets in endless toasts to their seemingly invincible king. Edward III was blessed, or perhaps cursed, with remarkable fertility. His queen, Philippa of Hainault, bore him 12 children who survived to adulthood, including 5 sons who would father lines of nobles whose competing claims would eventually tear England apart. In the flickering candlelight of that medieval court, as poets recited tales of chivalry and minstrels sang of eternal glory, no one could foresee that this very abundance of royal blood would become England's greatest curse. The king's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, seemed destined for greatness. Picture him in his prime, tall and commanding in his black armour, leading English armies to stunning victories at Crécy and Poitiers, where French knights fell like wheat before the storm of English arrows. The prince's reputation spread across Europe like ripples across a pond, and chroniclers wrote that he was the perfect flower of chivalry, a knight worthy of the Round Table itself. But fate, that ancient enemy of human ambition, had other plans. The Black Prince, worn down by years of campaigning in the fever-ridden marshes of Spain, began to sicken. On quiet nights in his chambers at Westminster, as autumn rain drummed against leaded windows, he would cough until blood stained the fine linen his physicians held to his lips. His father, the once mighty Edward III, was himself aging, his sharp mind growing cloudy with the weight of years and grief. When the Black Prince died in 3076, a year before his father, the crown's inheritance fell to his 10-year-old son, Richard. The boy king's uncles, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, suddenly found themselves as the most powerful men in the realm, their own ambitions awakening like wolves catching the scent of blood on the wind. John of Gaunt, tall and elegant with greying hair and calculating eyes, became the most influential figure in England. Through his marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, he had inherited vast estates across the north, making him almost as wealthy as the king himself. His younger brother, Edmund of York, ruled the rich lands of the Welsh Marches, while the fierce Thomas of Gloucester commanded respect through his military prowess and barely concealed contempt for compromise. These three brothers, sitting around their father's deathbed in the summer of 1377, could never have imagined that their descendants would spend the next century killing each other in pursuit of a crown that would prove more burden than blessing. The great Plantagenet eagle, which had soared so high for so long, carried within its very success the seeds of its own destruction. In the monasteries where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of ages past, learned men understood that all earthly kingdoms eventually crumble into dust. The wheel of fortune, they knew, turns for princes as surely as for peasants, and the same royal blood that elevates a man to greatness can become the cause of his downfall when too many possess an equal claim to its power. As young Richard II was crowned in Westminster Abbey, with all the pageantry and ceremony that medieval England could devise, the great lords who knelt before him in fealty spoke words of loyalty that would prove as fragile as morning mist. The Wars of the Roses had not yet begun, but their seeds were already germinating in the fertile soil of ambition, waiting for the right season to bloom into a harvest of blood and sorrow that would transform England forever. Richard II ascended to the throne of England as a golden-haired child of 10, crowned in Westminster Abbey on a summer day in 1377, when the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. Picture that coronation morning, the ancient stones of the abbey warmed by July sunshine streaming through stained glass windows, the boy king's small figure dwarfed by the heavy crown of saints and bays. Edward, his young voice barely audible as he spoke the sacred words that bound him to his realm. In those early years of his reign, when Richard's uncles served as his regents and guided the ship of state through the turbulent waters of the 100 Years' War, England seemed stable beneath the Plantagenet eagle. The royal court flourished with an almost magical brilliance, becoming a centre of learning and artistic achievement that drew scholars and poets from across Europe like moths to a glittering flame. Richard possessed his grandfather's love of beauty and ceremony, but where Edward III had balanced aesthetic refinement with the practical demands of kingship, young Richard increasingly retreated into a world of courtly splendour that grew ever more divorced from the harsh realities of governing a medieval realm. Imagine walking through his court at Westminster Palace. On a winter evening in the 1390s, you would find yourself in rooms hung with the finest tapestries from Flanders, where courtiers dressed in cloth of gold moved through elaborate rituals of deference to a king who demanded to be addressed on bended knee. The king's patronage of literature gave England some of its greatest early poetry. Geoffrey Chaucer, that gentle observer of human nature, moved through Richard's court like a kindly uncle, his eyes twinkling with secret amusement at the follies he witnessed. When Chaucer recited his tales of Canterbury pilgrims on quiet evenings, his voice carrying across halls lit by hundreds of candles, he painted word pictures of an England where common people lived lives of dignity and purpose, a vision that stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly rarefied atmosphere of royal power. But Richard's artistic sensibilities, admirable as they were, could not solve the practical problems that pressed upon his kingdom like gathering storm clouds. The ongoing war with France drained the royal treasury faster than rain fills a leaking bucket, while noble factions at court manoeuvred for influence with the relentless patience of spiders spinning webs. The young king, surrounded by flatterers who told him only what he wished to hear, began to believe that royal will alone could overcome any obstacle. The crisis that would ultimately destroy Richard began, like so many royal tragedies, with a family quarrel. His uncle John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, had returned from campaigns in Spain bearing the empty title of King of Castile and nursing wounded pride like a man tending a broken limb. When Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, quarrelled with Thomas Mowbray over accusations of treason, Richard made the fatal decision to resolve their dispute through trial by combat, then changed his mind at the last moment, banishing both men from England. Picture that scene at the lists of Coventry on a cold September morning in 1398. Two armoured figures on massive war horses, their lances glittering in the pale sunlight, the crowd holding its breath as heralds' trumpets prepared to sound the charge. Then Richard's voice cutting through the tension like a blade, stopping the combat before it could begin, his royal prerogative exercised with the casual authority of a man who had never learned that some powers are too dangerous to use. When John of Gaunt died in February 1399, his vast Lancastrian inheritance should have passed to his exiled son Henry. Instead, Richard seized the duchy for the crown, using those rich estates to fund his expedition to Ireland, while Henry Bolingbroke nursed his grievances in the court of France. In the tapestried chambers of French castles, as winter fires crackled in great hearths and wine flowed like water at royal feasts, Henry began to plan his return to England with the quiet determination of a man who believed justice was on his side. Richard's absence in Ireland gave Henry the opportunity he needed. In July 1399, the exiled Duke landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire with a small force of followers, claiming he had come only to reclaim his rightful inheritance. But inheritance, as Henry well knew, has a way of expanding when supported by popular discontent and the promise of better government. The king's hasty return from Ireland revealed the hollowness of his apparent power. As Richard's ship sailed up the Welsh coast in late summer, the king could see smoke rising from castles and towns where his enemies had already proclaimed Henry as England's rightful ruler. One by one, the great lords who had knelt before Richard in Westminster Abbey transferred their allegiance to the returning exile, their oaths of fealty proving as fragile as autumn leaves before the first frost. The final confrontation came at Flint Castle, where Richard waited like a tragic figure from ancient drama while Henry's forces surrounded him. Picture that August evening, the king standing alone on the castle battlements, watching the sun set over the Irish Sea while his cousin's banners approached through the gathering dusk. When Henry Bolingbroke finally entered the castle courtyard, their meeting carried all the weight of destiny, two men whose friendship had been destroyed by the impossible demands of medieval kingship. Richard's abdication in Westminster Hall marked the end of legitimate Plantagenet rule and established a precedent that would haunt England for generations. The sacred principle that kings ruled by divine right, appointed by God and answerable only to heaven, lay shattered like a precious vessel dropped on stone floors. Henry IV had proven that kings could be unmade by their subjects, a dangerous truth that would echo through English castles and manor houses for decades to come. In the Tower of London, where Richard spent his final months as Henry's prisoner, the deposed king had time to contemplate the wheel of fortune that had carried him from triumph to disaster. The boy who had been crowned in such splendour died in obscurity, his death as mysterious as winter mist, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been and the terrible knowledge that in England crowns could be won and lost through force of arms. Henry Bolingbroke took the throne of England as Henry IV in the autumn of 1399. But with his crown came a burden that would weigh upon his shoulders like a shirt of mail worn day and night for the rest of his life. The man who had overthrown Richard II in the name of justice and good governance discovered that ruling a kingdom was far more complex than conquering one, and that a crown gained through rebellion always sits uneasily on its wearer's head. Picture Henry in the early months of his reign, pacing the corridors of Westminster Palace in the grey hours before dawn, his footsteps echoing through halls where tapestries depicted the glorious deeds of his predecessors. Sleep came rarely to the usurper king, for in the darkness beyond his chamber windows he could sense the gathering of forces that questioned his right to rule. The principle of divine kingship, which had protected English monarchs for centuries like an invisible shield, lay broken at his feet, and he had no way to repair what his own ambition had shattered. The rebellions began almost immediately, sprouting across the kingdom like thorns in an untended garden. In the wild borderlands of Wales, Owen Glendower raised his dragon banner and proclaimed himself Prince of Wales by ancient right, his followers believing that the old prophecies spoke of a time when the Celtic peoples would drive the Saxon usurper from their lands. The Welsh mountains echoed with war cries in a tongue older than English, as Glendower's men struck like ghosts from mist-shrouded valleys before melting back into the landscape they knew better than any foreign king. More dangerous still was the rebellion of the Percy family, those proud lords of Northumberland who had helped Henry win his throne, but now questioned whether they had chosen the right side. Harry Hotspur, the most famous knight in England, possessed a reputation for battlefield prowess that made strong men tremble and inspired ballad singers from Yorkshire to Cornwall. When Hotspur raised his banner in revolt, claiming that Henry had broken his promises and proven himself unworthy of the crown, half the nobility of northern England watched and waited to see which way the wind of fate would blow. The Battle of Shrewsbury in July 1403 decided the immediate question of Henry's survival, but at a cost that would echo through English history like the tolling of funeral bells. Picture that summer afternoon, two armies facing each other across fields heavy with the scent of ripening grain, the air alive with the nervous whickering of war horses and the whispered prayers of men who knew that many would not see another sunrise. When the battle ended, Harry Hotspur lay dead among the common soldiers, his magnificent courage finally meeting an enemy it could not overcome. Henry IV, aged rapidly under the strain of constant vigilance, his dark hair turning grey as winter frost, while lines of worry carved themselves deeper into his face with each passing season. The man who had seemed so vital and confident during his triumphant return from exile began to suffer from mysterious ailments that physicians could neither diagnose nor cure. Perhaps the weight of an uneasy conscience made manifest in failing flesh. When Henry IV died in March 1413, worn out by the cares of kingship before his 50th birthday, his son ascended the throne as Henry V, with a determination to transform his father's legacy from cautionary tale to glorious triumph. The new king understood that the best way to unite a divided kingdom was to give it an external enemy worthy of its combined hatred. And France, ancient foe of English kings, beckoned across the channel like a golden prize waiting to be claimed. Henry V possessed all the qualities his father had lacked: unshakable self-confidence, genuine military genius, and the indefinable charisma that makes ordinary men willing to follow their leader into the mouth of hell itself. Picture him addressing his troops before the walls of Harfleur, his voice carrying clearly across ranks of English archers and men-at-arms whose faces bore the weathered look of professional soldiers. When Henry spoke of honour and England, hardened veterans who had seen too much death and suffering found themselves believing once again in causes greater than mere survival. The victory at Agincourt on October 25, 1405, transformed Henry V from usurper's son to national hero in a single afternoon of mud and blood and glory. The French knights, magnificent in their polished armour and silk surcoats, charged across rain-soaked fields into a storm of English arrows that fell like deadly hail from grey October skies. By evening, the flower of French nobility lay dead or captured, while Henry's small army counted their losses in dozens rather than hundreds, a victory so complete it seemed touched by divine favour. In the years that followed Agincourt, as English armies carved a path of conquest across northern France, Henry V appeared to have solved the fundamental problem of his dynasty's legitimacy through the simple expedient of being magnificently successful. The king who had inherited a kingdom divided by civil war and haunted by questions of rightful rule, now commanded the allegiance of nobles and commons alike, united in their pride at English victories that echoed the golden age of Edward III and the Black Prince. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 seemed to crown Henry's achievements with permanent success. By its terms, he would marry Catherine of Valois, daughter of the mad King Charles VI of France, and their children would inherit both the English and French crowns, creating a dual monarchy that might dominate Europe for centuries to come. Picture that wedding ceremony in Troyes Cathedral, the English king and French princess kneeling before the altar while bishops spoke the sacred words that would bind their nations together, the assembled nobility believing they were witnessing the birth of a new age of peace and prosperity. But fate, that ancient enemy of human ambition, had prepared one final cruel jest. In the summer of 1422, as Henry V planned new campaigns that would complete the conquest of France, the king who had seemed touched by invincible destiny began to suffer from dysentery contracted during the siege of Meaux. In a chamber of the castle of Vincennes, as August heat shimmered beyond the windows, and physicians burned aromatic herbs to ward off the evil humours that were slowly killing their patient, the greatest warrior king of his generation prepared to meet the one enemy no mortal courage could defeat. Henry V died on August 31st, 1422, just 35 years old and at the height of his power, leaving behind a 9-month-old son to inherit 2 kingdoms and all the problems that 2 generations of Lancastrian ambition had failed to solve. The infant Henry VI would grow up in the shadow of his father's impossible achievements, his minority providing the opening that ambitious men had long awaited to settle old scores and pursue new dreams of power. As autumn mists rose from the battlefields of France where so many Englishmen lay buried, the great nobles who had followed Henry V to glory began the long journey home to a kingdom where an infant king's weakness would soon awaken all the sleeping demons of civil strife. Henry VI came into the world on December 6, 1421, a cold winter day when snowflakes drifted past the windows of Windsor Castle like scattered prayers. And, from his first breath, the child seemed destined for sorrows that would break stronger hearts than his gentle one. 9 months after his birth, his father's death transformed the infant into King of England and France, 2 crowns too heavy for shoulders that had not yet learned to bear their own weight, much less the crushing burden of medieval kingship. Picture the young king's childhood in the great castles of his realm, a small figure in rich velvet moving through chambers vast enough to swallow his quiet voice, surrounded always by tutors, chaplains, and regents, whose faces bore the careful expressions of men walking on ice that might crack beneath their feet at any moment. While other children played at being knights and dragons, Henry learned Latin prayers and studied illuminated manuscripts depicting saints whose martyrdom seemed almost enviable compared to the trials of earthly rule. The Regency Council that governed England during Henry's minority included some of the ablest men of their generation, yet even their combined wisdom could not solve the fundamental problems that Henry V's early death had bequeathed to the realm. The Duke of Bedford, Henry's uncle, strove valiantly to maintain English conquests in France with steadily diminishing resources, while at home the Duke of Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort manoeuvred against each other with the patient intensity of chess masters playing for the highest possible stakes. As Henry grew from child to youth, those who knew him best began to recognize that Providence had fashioned him for the cloister rather than the throne room. The king found genuine joy in simple acts of devotion, hearing morning mass in his private chapel, where candles flickered before images of the Virgin Mary, walking in the gardens of his palaces, where he would stop to speak gently to the humblest gardener, spending hours in conversation with learned clerks about matters of theology that seemed infinitely more interesting to him than the practical details of governing a kingdom. When Henry finally assumed personal rule in the early 1440s, his subjects discovered they were governed by a man whose saintly virtues were perhaps too pure for the compromised world of medieval politics. The king, who should have been leading armies to defend his father's conquests in France, preferred to spend his time planning new colleges and churches, his artistic soul finding expression in the soaring stones of King's College Chapel at Cambridge and Eton College, monuments to learning that would outlast most of the battles his ancestors had won. The French, led by a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints, began their inexorable recovery of territories that had been English for generations. Joan of Arc's victories at Orléans and Patay seemed to prove that God's favour had shifted from the English to their enemies, and one by one, the cities and castles that Henry V had conquered returned to French hands like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Henry VI watched his inheritance slip away with the resigned sadness of a man who had never truly believed it belonged to him in the first place. The loss of France might have been bearable if England herself had remained stable, but the king's very virtues created a vacuum that ambitious men rushed to fill like air entering a broken vessel. Henry's reluctance to punish his enemies or reward his friends with the calculated ruthlessness that medieval kingship required meant that the great nobles of the realm began to look elsewhere for the strong leadership their turbulent age demanded. Into this vacuum stepped Margaret of Anjou, the French princess who became Henry's queen in 1445, and quickly discovered that her husband's gentle nature left her to play the role traditionally reserved for kings. Picture Margaret in the council chambers of Westminster Palace, a young woman whose beauty was matched only by her fierce intelligence, her dark eyes flashing with impatience as elderly courtiers debated points of protocol, while the kingdom's enemies gained strength with each passing day. She possessed all the qualities Henry lacked: ruthless determination, political cunning, and the warrior's instinct to strike first and hardest. But fate had made her a woman in an age when such qualities were expected only in men. The birth of Prince Edward in 1453 should have secured the Lancastrian dynasty for another generation, but instead it precipitated the crisis that would destroy the house of Henry VI. The king's mental collapse during his wife's pregnancy, whether from hereditary madness inherited from his French grandfather or simply from the accumulated strain of trying to be something nature had never intended, left England in the hands of a foreign queen and her infant son, while the great nobles of the realm watched and calculated their chances like wolves circling a wounded stag. Richard, Duke of York, emerged from this crisis as the kingdom's most obvious alternative to Lancastrian weakness. Unlike Henry VI's, York possessed all the traditional virtues of medieval nobility: military competence proven in the French wars, administrative ability demonstrated during his governance of Ireland, and most importantly, a genealogical claim to the throne that many considered superior to Henry's own. When Parliament appointed York as protector during the king's incapacity, thoughtful observers began to wonder whether England might be better served by a king who could actually fulfill the demanding responsibilities of medieval monarchy. Henry's recovery from his mental breakdown in late 1454 restored him to nominal authority, but the kingdom had tasted effective government during York's protectorate and found it more palatable than royal sainthood. The gentle king who returned to consciousness discovered that his realm had changed during his absence, like a garden left untended through a long winter, and that the weeds of faction and ambition had taken root too deeply to be easily pulled. The tragedy of Henry VI was not that he was evil or incompetent in any conventional sense, but rather that he was a genuinely good man thrust into a role that required qualities he could never possess. In an age when kings were expected to be warriors, judges, and politicians rolled into one formidable figure, Henry remained what he had always been, a pious, scholarly, deeply compassionate human being whose greatest joy came from acts of charity and devotion that would have made him an exemplary monk but could never make him an effective king. As the great lords of England began to choose sides in the approaching conflict between Lancaster and York, Henry VI continued to find solace in his prayers and his books, perhaps understanding better than anyone that the storm gathering around his throne was beyond his power to control. The man who had inherited the glorious legacy of Agincourt would leave behind a realm divided against itself, where white roses and red roses would bloom in fields watered with English blood for 30 years to come. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Henry knelt in his private chapel and offered his daily prayers for the souls of his subjects, the pious king may have sensed that his own greatest contribution to England's welfare would ultimately be his willingness to step aside when stronger hands were needed to guide the ship of state through the tempest he had been unable to prevent. In the depths of winter 1453, while King Henry VI lay insensible in his chambers at Windsor Castle, his mind lost in shadows that no physician could illuminate, Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, sat in his castle at Fotheringhay examining documents that would change the course of English history. Picture that December evening, snow falling steadily beyond the leaded windows, candles flickering in their sconces as York spread ancient parchments across an oak table worn smooth by generations of his ancestors, their wax seals and faded ink telling a story that would soon be written in blood across the realm. The genealogical claim that Richard of York discovered in those family chronicles was not merely strong, it was, by the strict rules of medieval inheritance, virtually unassailable. Through his mother, Anne Mortimer, York descended from Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, the second surviving son of Edward III. The Lancastrian kings traced their lineage through John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who was Edward III's third son. In an age when bloodlines determined destiny and primogeniture was sacred law, York's claim carried the weight of mathematical certainty. The senior line should inherit before the junior, regardless of which had seized the throne first. But York understood, as all medieval nobles did, that genealogical rights meant nothing without the power to enforce them. As he traced the ancient bloodlines with his finger, following the careful script of long-dead scribes who had recorded births and deaths and marriages without knowing they were mapping the future of kingdoms, York contemplated the delicate balance between justice and pragmatism that had governed noble politics for centuries. His own career had prepared him well for the challenges ahead. In Ireland, where he had served as the king's lieutenant, York had learned to govern with the firm hand that Henry VI could never master, bringing order to a land that had known little but chaos since the Norman invasion. The wild Irish chieftains, who laughed at royal writs and treaties, had come to respect the Duke of York's combination of military prowess and administrative competence, recognizing in him the qualities of leadership that commanded obedience without demanding love. The Welsh marches, where York's great estate sprawled across counties that had seen more violence than most battlefields, had also schooled him in the harsh realities of medieval power. Here, in castles perched on windswept hills where English law met Celtic defiance, York had learned that effective rule required the ability to be both judge and executioner, to show mercy when strength could afford it, and ruthless determination when weakness invited disaster. As news of Henry VI's collapse spread through the kingdom like ripples on a winter pond, the great nobles of England began to calculate their positions with the careful precision of merchants weighing gold. The Earl of Warwick, that master of political intrigue whose vast estates in the north made him nearly as powerful as York himself, sent discreet messages of support to Fotheringhay Castle. The Neville family, whose network of marriages and alliances stretched across the breadth of England, began to align themselves with the Duke whose competence contrasted so sharply with Lancastrian weakness. York's initial goals were limited and reasonable. Or so he told himself during those long winter nights when ambition and duty warred within his conscience like angels wrestling in the darkness. He sought not to overthrow Henry VI, but to serve as protector of the realm during the king's incapacity, bringing to bear his proven abilities in Ireland and Wales to heal the wounds that incompetent governance had inflicted upon England. When Parliament appointed him to that role in March 1444, York may have believed that effective administration would be sufficient to restore the kingdom's fortunes. Picture York in his new role, moving through the corridors of Westminster Palace with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command, his voice cutting through the confused babble of courtly politics like a sharp blade through silk. Under his protection, English merchants found their trade routes reopened and their goods protected by royal authority that actually meant something. The king's finances, so long a source of scandal and weakness, began to show the discipline that York had imposed on his own vast estates. For the first time in years, royal writs were obeyed not because men feared punishment, but because they respected the competence of the government that issued them. But competence, however admirable, could not solve the fundamental problem of legitimacy that haunted the Lancastrian dynasty like a curse that passed from father to son. Henry VI had inherited not only his grandfather's throne, but also his grandfather's sin. The usurpation of Richard II that had shattered the ancient principle of divine right and opened the question of who could rightfully rule England. York's superior genealogical claim was like a sword hanging over every Lancastrian head, invisible perhaps to common subjects, but clearly visible to every great lord who understood the complex mathematics of medieval bloodlines. When Henry VI recovered his senses in late 1454, returning to consciousness like a man waking from a dream he could not quite remember, he found his kingdom transformed by York's effective governance. The gentle king, whose greatest pleasure had always come from acts of charity and devotion, discovered that his subjects had learned to prefer competent administration to saintly incompetence, a lesson more bitter than any medicine his physicians had ever forced him to swallow. Queen Margaret, that fierce protector of her husband's rights and her infant son's inheritance, recognized in York's success a threat more dangerous than any army. The Duke's very competence was an implicit criticism of everything the Lancastrian dynasty represented, and his genealogical claim provided a legal foundation for ambitions that his administrative success made increasingly plausible. When she looked at York, Margaret saw not a loyal subject serving his king, but a usurper waiting for his moment, and her feminine intuition may have been more accurate than all the subtle calculations of male politicians. The stage was set for conflict not between good and evil, as later propagandists would claim, but between two different concepts of legitimate authority: the Lancastrian principle that successful usurpation creates its own right to rule, and the Yorkist belief that blood will tell and ancient rights cannot be permanently denied. In the spring of 1455, as England awakened from winter's sleep and the first flowers began to bloom in castle gardens across the realm, thoughtful observers might have noticed that among those early blossoms, the white roses seemed to be blooming with unusual vigour, as if drawing strength from soil that had been too long neglected. The morning of May 22nd, 1455, dawned grey and misty over the market town of St. Post, Albans, where the great abbey bells had called monks to prayer for more than 8 centuries, their bronze voices carrying across fields where sheep grazed peacefully, unaware that history was about to transform their quiet corner of Hertfordshire into England's first battlefield of civil war. Picture that early morning, dew still glistening on the cobblestones of the narrow streets where merchants would normally be setting up their stalls, the air soft with the promise of late spring, and nowhere the slightest sign that before the sun reached its zenith, the blood of great lords would be soaking into the ancient stones. King Henry VI had ridden north from London with a small royal army, ostensibly to hold a great council at Leicester, but in reality to confront the Duke of York and his supporters who had been gathering their forces in the northern counties. The king's party numbered perhaps 2,000 men. Not a vast host by the standards of the great battles that would follow, but sufficient to overawe any reasonable opposition. Among Henry's company rode some of the greatest names in England: Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, whose family had served the Lancastrian cause with unwavering loyalty, the Earl of Northumberland, that proud Percy whose ancestors had fought at Shrewsbury, and Thomas, Lord Clifford, whose red rose badge would soon be stained with his own life's blood. York's force, approaching from the north, was smaller still, perhaps 3,000 men at most, many of them archers from the Welsh marches, whose longbows had been seasoned in the endless border warfare that had made those counties the kingdom's hardest school of war. Beside York rode his most formidable ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, already showing the political cunning and military skill that would earn him the title Kingmaker before the wars were done. The Earl of Salisbury, Warwick's father, completed the Yorkist triumvirate, 3 men whose combined power could challenge even royal authority when that authority was wielded by hands as weak as Henry VI's. The confrontation at St. Tac. Albans began not as a planned battle but as a failed negotiation, the kind of political miscalculation that often proves more dangerous than deliberate malice. Both sides arrived at the town believing they could overawe their opponents without actually fighting, following the traditional medieval pattern where armed confrontation was usually resolved through bargaining rather than bloodshed. The narrow streets of St. Albans seemed designed for peaceful commerce rather than warfare, their buildings so close together that armed men could barely maneuver in formation. For several hours, as the May sun climbed higher and townspeople barricaded themselves behind shuttered windows, messages passed back and forth between the royal party in the marketplace and the Yorkist forces positioned in the surrounding streets. Henry VI, true to his peaceful nature, seemed genuinely hopeful that words could accomplish what weapons might render unnecessary. York, for his part, maintained that he sought not to harm the king but only to remove the evil counsellors who had led England into weakness and defeat, a formula as old as medieval politics itself and usually as hollow. But the Duke of Somerset, that proud Beaufort whose family honour had been built on generations of loyal service to the Lancastrian crown, refused to accept the implied criticism of his counsel or his conduct. When York's final ultimatum demanded Somerset's surrender for trial, the Duke's response was swift and uncompromising. He would yield to no man save the king himself, and certainly not to a subject who dared question royal policy while hiding behind claims of genealogical superiority. The battle, when it finally came, lasted barely an hour. Picture the scene as Warwick's archers, finding their way through the gardens and back lanes that the royal forces had left unguarded, suddenly appeared on the flanks of the Lancastrian line like wolves emerging from morning mist. The sound of their bowstraves releasing echoed off the narrow walls of St. Sast. Albans streets, and in moments the orderly ranks of royal men-at-arms dissolved into confusion as cloth-yard shafts found their marks with the deadly precision that had made English archery famous from Scotland to France. Somerset fell in the first moments of combat, struck down by an arrow that ended not just his life, but his family's long dominance in royal councils. The Earl of Northumberland died beside him, that proud Percy whose ancestors had challenged kings and been broken for their presumption. Lord Clifford, struck down as he tried to rally his men, left behind a son whose thirst for vengeance would echo through the coming decades like the tolling of a funeral bell. King Henry VI, that gentle soul who had never sought conflict with anyone, was wounded in the neck by an arrow, whether deliberately aimed or merely a stray shot, no one could say. The sight of royal blood flowing in the streets of St. Tar, Albans transformed a political dispute into something far more dangerous, a precedent that English nobles could take up arms against their anointed sovereign and prosper from their rebellion. When the fighting ended, as suddenly as it had begun, the narrow streets lay littered with bodies that would have to be explained to a kingdom unprepared for civil war. York knelt before the wounded king in a gesture of formal submission that fooled no one, least of all the commons who had watched their betters settle their differences with steel rather than words. The Duke's protestation that he had sought only to remove evil counsellors rang hollow when those counsellors lay dead in the marketplace, their blood already attracting flies in the warming afternoon air. The aftermath of St. Albans revealed the terrible problem that would haunt England for the next 30 years. How could men who had killed each other's friends and kinsmen ever trust each other enough to share the same kingdom? The seeds of endless vengeance had been planted in English soil, and they would grow into a harvest of sorrow that would stretch far beyond the lifetimes of anyone present on that May morning when the Wars of the Roses began with such deceptively gentle bloodshed. As the sun set over St. Albans on May 22nd, 1455, and the abbey bells tolled vespers as they had for centuries, the monks who had witnessed England's first battle of civil war could not have known they were hearing the opening notes of a funeral dirge that would play for 3 decades across a realm that had forgotten how to live in peace. In the years that followed the bloodshed at St. Albans, England discovered that civil war, like a fever in the human body, follows its own inexorable logic, consuming the very strength it claims to restore and creating new grievances faster than old ones can be healed. The wheel of fortune that medieval men understood governed all earthly affairs began to turn with increasing speed, carrying great lords from triumph to disaster and back again, with a rhythm as predictable as the turning of the seasons, yet as shocking as unexpected death. The Battle of Blore Heath, fought on a crisp September morning in 1459, showed how quickly the character of the conflict was changing from the almost accidental bloodshed of Saint-Saintin Albans to something approaching modern warfare in its calculated brutality. Picture that Staffordshire landscape in early autumn, golden fields of harvested grain stretching toward horizons hazed with smoke from cottage chimneys, the air sharp with the promise of winter, and across this peaceful scene the glitter of steel as 2 armies manoeuvred for advantage like chess masters playing with living pieces. James Touchet, Lord Audley, commanded the royal forces with the confident bearing of a man who had never doubted that loyalty to his anointed king would be rewarded with victory. His army, numerically superior to the Yorkist rebels and flushed with recent successes, advanced across Blore Heath with banners flying and trumpets sounding the ancient calls that had summoned English armies to glory for centuries. But Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, the Grain Patriarch of the Yorkist cause, had chosen his ground with the careful eye of a veteran who understood that in war, terrain matters more than courage. The Yorkist archers, positioned behind hedgerows that had been planted by peaceful farmers who never imagined their boundaries would channel knights to their deaths, waited with the patient stillness of hunters watching for deer. When Audley's cavalry charged across the heath, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth like approaching thunder, they rode directly into a storm of arrows that fell among them like deadly rain. The flower of Lancastrian chivalry withered in moments, transformed from proud warriors into broken figures scattered across ground that would remember their names long after their bodies had returned to dust. Lord Audley himself fell in that first terrible charge, his death sending ripples of shock through the royal army that had expected easy victory over outnumbered rebels. The survivors, their confidence shattered like glass against stone, discovered that supporting the rightful king provided no protection against skillfully deployed longbows and leaders who understood the grim mathematics of medieval warfare better than they understood the traditional codes of chivalric honour. But the wheel of fortune, having raised York and his allies to this height of success, prepared to cast them down again with equal swiftness. At Ludford Bridge in October 1459, the Yorkist cause experienced a humiliation more complete than any military defeat. Their army simply melted away in the autumn darkness, like morning mist touched by the sun's first rays. The defection of Andrew Trollope and his experienced Calais soldiers, men who had fought beside the Yorkists in their earlier victories, showed how fragile the bonds of loyalty had become in a kingdom where oaths could be broken as easily as promises made to children. York fled to Ireland, that familiar refuge for English nobles whose ambitions had outrun their immediate prospects, while his son Edward and the Earl of Warwick sought shelter in Calais, where English wool merchants provided a more reliable foundation for political exile than the shifting loyalties of noble allies. In the Great Hall of Dublin Castle, where torchlight flickered against walls decorated with the arms of English kings, York contemplated the bitter lesson that righteousness alone could not overcome the practical advantages of controlling the royal name and the royal treasury. The Battle of Northampton in July 1460 demonstrated how quickly fortune's wheel could reverse the previous year's disasters. Picture that summer evening, thunderclouds building over the Midlands as two armies faced each other across fields where cattle normally grazed in peaceful ignorance of human ambitions, the air heavy with moisture that would soon transform dust into mud and make cannon powder useless as sand. When the storm broke, it seemed that nature herself had chosen sides in England's civil war, rendering the royal artillery helpless while Yorkist infantry advanced through rain that soaked them to the skin but could not dampen their determination. The Earl of Warwick, returning from his Calais exile with a small but veteran force, proved once again that military skill could overcome numerical disadvantage when combined with careful planning and favourable circumstances. The capture of King Henry VI during the battle. The gentle monarch found sitting in his tent, reading a book of devotions while the storm raged around him, symbolised the complete breakdown of Lancastrian authority and the triumph of Yorkist competence over royal legitimacy. But even as York returned from Ireland to claim what seemed like final victory, the wheel continued its remorseless turning. The confrontation at Wakefield on December 30th, 1460, showed how pride and overconfidence could transform certain triumph into utter catastrophe in the space of a winter afternoon. Richard of York, perhaps believing that his enemies were as weak as they appeared, or simply tired of the careful manoeuvring that had characterized his long struggle for recognition, allowed himself to be drawn into battle against odds that no prudent commander would have accepted. Picture that scene in the grey December light, snow beginning to fall across Yorkshire fields where the white rose had seemed to bloom most strongly, the bare trees etching black patterns against a sky that promised more winter storms to come. The Lancastrian forces, led by Queen Margaret and the young Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, son of the man, killed at St. Two, Albans had been reinforced by Scottish soldiers whose loyalty could be purchased with English gold and French allies who saw opportunity in England's divisions. When the battle was over, the Duke of York lay dead among his followers, his body bearing witness to the terrible price of political miscalculation. His 17-year-old son, Edmund of Rutland, had been cut down while trying to flee, murdered in cold blood by Lord Clifford in revenge for his father's death at 17-year-old son, Albans. A killing that broke every code of chivalric conduct, but satisfied the deeper demands of blood vengeance that civil war had awakened in English hearts. The aftermath at Wakefield showed how far the conflict had descended from political dispute into something approaching tribal warfare. York's head, crowned with a paper mockery of royal dignity, was displayed on the walls of the city whose name he had borne with such pride, while his followers' bodies were left unburied on the frozen battlefield as food for ravens. The gentle conventions that had once limited the brutality of noble warfare lay as dead as the Duke himself, swept away by hatreds that grew stronger with each exchange of blood. Yet even in the depth of Yorkist disaster, the wheel of fortune prepared another revolution. Edward, Earl of March, York's eldest surviving son, was marching south from the Welsh borders with an army drawn from the same tough borderland that had bred generations of English soldiers. At 19, the future Edward IV had already shown glimpses of the military genius that would make him one of England's greatest warrior kings, and the news of his father's death had transformed grief into a steel-hard determination to claim the inheritance that blood and battle had made his birthright. As 1460 gave way to 1461, with winter's grip tightening across a kingdom that had forgotten the meaning of peace, thoughtful observers might have wondered whether the wheel of fortune would ever stop turning, or if England was doomed to see her greatest families destroy each other in an endless cycle of vengeance and ambition that would continue until there were no more great names left to kill. Edward Plantagenet, Earl of March. received the news of his father's death at Wakefield while winter winds howled across the Welsh borderlands, carrying with them whispers of disaster that would have broken a weaker man's spirit, but only sharpened the young Earl's resolve like steel tempered in fire. At 19, Edward possessed physical gifts that seemed designed by Providence for the harsh demands of medieval kingship. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, his golden hair catching torchlight like a crown, even before any crown touched his brow. And his presence commanded attention in any gathering as naturally as the sun commands the day. The transformation from grieving son to implacable avenger took place in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Where Richard of York had spent years building careful legal arguments for his claim to the throne, his heir understood instinctively that crowns were won not in council chambers but on battlefields, not through parchment genealogies but through the terrible arithmetic of dead enemies and living followers. The young man who had been Earl of March in the morning became King Edward IV by his own proclamation before the sun set, trusting to his sword arm and his followers' loyalty to make good on a claim that his father's death had sealed in blood. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross, fought in the grey February dawn of 1461, announced the arrival of a new kind of king in England. Picture that Herefordshire morning, frost glittering on bare branches like scattered diamonds, the mist rising from the River Lug carrying the sound of armed men preparing for combat, and above it all, the phenomenon that would become part of Edward's legend. Owen Tudor, that Welsh adventurer who had risen to marry a queen and father a royal dynasty, met his end on the scaffold at Hereford after the battle, his grey head rolling in the market square where common merchants had hawked their wares in peaceful times. The old man's death closed a chapter of romantic improbability that had begun when a humble squire caught the eye of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow, proving once again that in the brutal world of civil war, even the most charming stories must end in blood and sorrow. But Edward's greatest test lay ahead, in the snowy fields around a village called Towton, where on Palm Sunday 1461, the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil would determine whether the white rose or the red would bloom in England's royal garden. The approach to battle unfolded like a medieval epic, 2 massive armies converging on Yorkshire through the last storms of winter, their combined strength representing nearly every fighting man of noble blood in the kingdom, and all of them understanding that this single day would likely decide the fate of England for generations to come. Picture the scene as dawn broke over Towton Dale on that fateful Palm Sunday, snow falling so thickly that men could barely see 50 yards ahead, the wind driving the flakes horizontally across a landscape that seemed designed by God for battles rather than farming, its rolling hills providing natural stages for the drama about to unfold. The Lancastrian army, commanded by the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Northumberland, under the nominal leadership of King Henry VI, numbered perhaps 60,000 men, the largest English army assembled since Agincourt, drawn from every corner of the realm that still acknowledged Lancastrian authority. Edward's force was smaller, but possessed advantages that would prove decisive in the coming slaughter. His men had marched through the night to reach the battlefield, their fatigue balanced by the desperate energy of soldiers who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the extinction of their cause. More importantly, they held the wind at their backs, a factor that would transform archery from an art into wholesale massacre when the storm of arrows began. The battle commenced with the systematic destruction of Lancastrian hopes through the methodical application of English longbow technique perfected through decades of continental warfare. Edward's archers, positioned on the ridge above the Yorkist battle line, could shoot their cloth-yard shafts with the wind's assistance while their enemies' arrows fell short, creating a killing zone where Lancastrian soldiers died without ever striking a blow in return. For hours this terrible arithmetic continued, death falling from the grey sky like snow, accumulating in drifts of men who had wakened that morning believing in their cause and their courage. When the archery phase ended and the lines closed for hand-to-hand combat, the battle became a test of will as much as skill. In the churning mud created by snow and blood, where footing was uncertain, and every step might be a man's last, Edward IV proved himself worthy of the crown he claimed. Picture the young king in the thick of battle, his great sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, his golden surcoat darkening with blood that was mostly not his own, his voice somehow carrying above the din to encourage followers who looked to him for the leadership that only personal example could provide. The turning point came when the Duke of Norfolk arrived with Yorkist reinforcements, fresh troops striking the Lancastrian flank like a hammer blow against an anvil that was already cracking under unbearable pressure. The royal army, which had fought with desperate courage for hours, finally broke, as armies always break when endurance reaches its limit. The retreat became a rout, the rout became a massacre, and the massacre continued until the sun set on a day that had cost England the flower of an entire generation. The casualties at Towton may have reached 28,000 men, a number so large it beggars imagination, representing perhaps 1% of England's entire population dead in a single afternoon. The River Cock, swollen with snowmelt and blood, was said to run red for days afterward, carrying the evidence of England's self-destruction toward the distant sea. Among the dead lay names that had shaped English history for centuries. The Earl of Northumberland, Lord Dacre, Sir Andrew Trollope, men whose families had served kings since the Norman conquest, now reduced to carrion for ravens and wolves. Edward's victory was so complete it seemed to settle the question of rightful rule through the simple expedient of eliminating most of those who might have disputed it. Henry VI fled north with Queen Margaret and their young son, becoming fugitives in their own kingdom, while Edward entered London in triumph to claim a crown that no longer had any visible rivals. The coronation that followed was magnificent beyond anything England had seen for generations, as if the new king understood that pageantry and ceremony were necessary to transform a successful warlord into a legitimate monarch. In the early years of his reign, Edward IV seemed to justify every hope his supporters had placed in him. The kingdom that had been torn apart by decades of civil war began to heal under the guidance of a king who understood that effective government was the foundation of lasting power. Trade revived as merchants regained confidence in royal protection. The law courts functioned efficiently for the first time in memory, and the royal finances achieved the kind of stability that competent administration makes possible even without extraordinary resources. Edward's court became a magnet for scholars, artists, and diplomats who had avoided England during the worst years of civil war. The king who had won his throne through military prowess proved surprisingly sophisticated in cultural matters, patronising the printing press that William Caxton established at Westminster and supporting architectural projects that would beautify his kingdom for centuries to come. Foreign observers noted with surprise that the warrior who had triumphed at Towton possessed the intellectual curiosity and artistic sensitivity that medieval ideals of kingship demanded, but rarely found combined with military competence. Yet beneath the surface success of Edward's early reign lay problems that would eventually threaten everything he had accomplished. The king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, a love match that caught his entire kingdom by surprise, created resentments among the great nobles who had expected their sacrifices during the Civil War to be rewarded with advantageous royal marriages for their own families. More dangerously still, it planted the seeds of conflict with Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker whose military genius had been essential to Edward's triumph, but whose political ambitions now seemed increasingly incompatible with the independence his former protégé was determined to maintain. The relationship between Edward IV and Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, had been forged in the crucible of civil war, tempered by shared dangers and sealed by mutual victories that had transformed England's political landscape like an earthquake, reshaping the very foundations of the realm. Yet by the middle of the 1460s, as Edward grew into his role as king and Warwick aged into his position as England's greatest nobleman, the partnership that had seemed unbreakable began to show hairline cracks that would eventually widen into chasms deep enough to swallow kingdoms. Picture Warwick at the height of his power, a man in his late 30s whose wealth rivaled that of many kings, whose network of marriages and alliances stretched from Scotland to Burgundy, and whose personal military capabilities had earned him a reputation that made foreign princes court his friendship, and rival nobles calculate their chances of survival should they earn his enmity. The great castles that dotted his northern estates, Middleham, Sheriff Hutton, Warwick itself, served as regional capitals where the Earl held court with almost royal magnificence, dispensing justice, organising trade, and commanding loyalties that sometimes seemed to supersede those owed to the crown itself. The first serious crack in their relationship appeared over Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in May 1464, a secret ceremony that caught Warwick completely off guard and demonstrated that the king he had placed on the throne was prepared to make decisions without consulting the man who had made those decisions possible. Imagine Warwick's feelings when he learned that while he had been negotiating a French marriage alliance that would have cemented England's diplomatic position and enhanced his own prestige as the kingdom's premier statesman, his protégé had been conducting a clandestine courtship that would render all those careful preparations worthless. Elizabeth Woodville brought to her marriage not just her considerable personal beauty, but a large family whose rapid advancement created new centres of power that threatened the established balance of noble influence. The Woodvilles, formerly minor gentry from the Welsh borders, suddenly found themselves elevated to the highest ranks of the nobility through a series of marriages and appointments that seemed designed to create a royal party independent of the great lords who had fought in the Civil War. Earl Rivers, the new Queen's father, became Treasurer of England. Her brother Anthony became a power in the royal household, and her sisters and cousins were married to the heirs of ancient noble families with a systematic efficiency that suggested careful political calculation. Warwick watched this transformation with the growing unease of a man who had spent years building a political system only to see it altered beyond recognition by forces he could not control. The Earl, who had been the decisive voice in Edward's councils, found himself increasingly marginalised as the king relied more heavily on his wife's relatives and less on the northern magnates who had won him his throne. Foreign ambassadors, who had once sought Warwick's permission before approaching the English court, now discovered that the real power lay with men whose names had been unknown 5 years earlier. The breach widened over foreign policy, that arena where medieval kings most clearly demonstrated their independence from noble oversight. Warwick favoured an alliance with France, partly from genuine conviction that French friendship would benefit England, and partly because he had invested considerable personal prestige in negotiations with Louis XIII, that Spider King whose web of intrigue stretched across Europe. Edward, however, preferred friendship with Burgundy, whose duke was not only a more natural ally against French ambitions, but also a more reliable customer for English wool, the trade that provided the crown with much of its independent revenue. When Edward concluded the Treaty of Peronne with Charles the Bold of Burgundy in 1468, effectively repudiating the French negotiations that Warwick had conducted with royal authority, the Earl understood that his position as England's premier statesman had been terminally undermined. The man who had been called the Kingmaker discovered that kings, once made, possessed an inconvenient tendency to think and act for themselves, and that the very success of his creation had made his own continued dominance impossible. The final break came over a matter that seemed almost trivial, but carried profound symbolic importance: the marriage of Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, to Warwick's elder daughter Isabel. Edward forbade the match, not from any personal dislike of his brother or the Neville family, but from an understanding that such a marriage would create a potential alternative power centre within the royal family itself. Clarence, always the most unstable and ambitious of the royal brothers, possessed a strong claim to the throne in his own right, and his marriage to Warwick's daughter would cement an alliance between the kingdom's wealthiest nobleman and a prince whose loyalty to his royal brother had never been entirely reliable. Warwick's response demonstrated the depth of his transformation from loyal kingmaker to dangerous rebel. In July 1469, while Edward was campaigning in the north, the Earl arranged for Clarence's marriage to Isabel to take place at Calais, directly defying royal prohibition and essentially declaring his independence from royal authority. The ceremony, conducted in the chapel of Calais Castle with all the pageantry that medieval nobility could devise, was both a wedding and a declaration of war, binding together the kingdom's most ambitious prince with its most powerful nobleman in an alliance that could only end in Edward's destruction or their own. The rebellion that followed showed how far Warwick's influence extended beyond his own estates. Across northern England, men who had served under his banner in the civil wars rose again at his call, their loyalty to the Neville name proving stronger than their oaths to the crown. The Battle of Edgecote in July 1469 resulted in a crushing defeat for royal forces, the capture of the king himself, and the execution of several members of the Woodville family. A clear demonstration that Warwick intended to return to the old arrangement where he wielded power behind a figurehead monarch. But Edward IV was no longer the young earl who had needed Warwick's guidance to claim his throne. The king who had won Towton through personal courage and tactical brilliance had learned political lessons during his years of rule, and he understood that submission to Warwick's renewed dominance would transform him from sovereign into puppet. Through a combination of careful diplomacy and timely concessions, Edward managed to escape from Warwick's custody and rebuild his military position with remarkable speed, proving that royal authority, once properly established, could survive temporary setbacks that would have destroyed weaker foundations. The final act of Warwick's rebellion unfolded like a Greek tragedy, with former allies becoming mortal enemies and the Wheel of Fortune completing another of its remorseless revolutions. In March 1470, after Edward had defeated another Warwick rebellion at the Battle of Luzacote Field, the Earl who had once seemed invincible was forced to flee England like a common criminal, seeking shelter in France with Louis XV, the same king whose friendship he had once urged upon his ungrateful royal protégé. The irony was complete when Warwick, in his French exile, allied himself with Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian queen whose cause he had spent years destroying and whose son he had helped make an orphan king in exile. The marriage of his younger daughter Anne to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian prince, sealed an alliance that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, but which the logic of rebellion had made inevitable. Two former enemies, united by their shared hatred of the king who had rejected their guidance, prepared to invade England together, proving that in the strange world of civil war, today's enemy could become tomorrow's ally if hatred burned strong enough to overcome the memory of old grievances. Edward IV's exile in Burgundy during the autumn and winter of 1470-71 might have broken the spirit of a lesser man, but for the warrior king who had won his throne through personal courage and military genius. Temporary defeat served only to clarify his understanding of what needed to be done. Picture Edward in the court of his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a tall figure whose golden hair had begun to show threads of grey, his blue eyes reflecting the cold calculation that exile had taught him, planning his return to England with the methodical precision of a craftsman preparing his finest work. The Burgundian court, with its wealth derived from Flemish cloth-making and its political sophistication honed by generations of ducal diplomacy, provided Edward with both material support and valuable lessons in statecraft. Here, surrounded by merchants and soldiers whose loyalty could be purchased with promises of English trade concessions and military alliance, the exiled king learned to appreciate the importance of economic foundations for political power. The gold that Charles provided for Edward's restoration was an investment in Burgundian commercial interests as much as an act of family loyalty. Meanwhile, in England, the brief restoration of Henry VI demonstrated the impossibility of turning back the clock of history through wishful thinking and foreign gold. The gentle king who had been rescued from the Tower of London and placed once again upon the throne he had never wanted remained what he had always been, a pious, scholarly figure whose genuine virtues were entirely unsuited to the harsh demands of medieval kingship. Warwick, ruling in Henry's name as he had once hoped to rule in Edward's, discovered that the kingdom which had accepted strong government grudgingly would not tolerate weak government at all. Edward's landing at Ravenspur on March 14, 1471, deliberately echoed Henry Bolingbroke's return from exile 72 years earlier, as if the wheel of English history had completed another full revolution and returned to its starting point. The small force that accompanied Edward, perhaps 1,500 men at most, many of them Flemish mercenaries whose loyalty extended only as far as their pay, seemed pathetically inadequate to challenge an established government backed by the Earl of Warwick's military reputation and Henry VI's legitimate claim to royal authority. But Edward understood, as Warwick apparently did not, that political legitimacy in 15th century England rested not on abstract legal principles but on demonstrated competence in government. The kingdom that had suffered through Henry VI's weak rule, endured the chaos of civil war, and then experienced the benefits of Edward's effective administration, was prepared to welcome back the king who had given them peace and prosperity, even at the cost of supporting what was technically a rebellion against their lawfully restored sovereign. The march from Ravenspur to London became a masterpiece of political theatre as much as military strategy. Edward's claim that he sought only his Duchy of York, not the crown itself, allowed cautious nobles to support him without committing treason, while his growing success attracted followers who smelled victory like hounds scenting a fox. By the time Edward reached the gates of London, his small invasion force had swelled to an army capable of challenging Warwick's power, and the city that had celebrated his overthrow just months earlier prepared to welcome his return with the enthusiasm that English crowds reserved for winners. The Battle of Barnet, fought in thick fog on Easter Sunday morning, April 14, 1471, settled the account between Edward IV and the man who had made and unmade him with a finality that seemed almost supernatural in its completeness. Picture that grey dawn, mist rising from Hertfordshire fields so thick that men could barely see their own banners, the confusion of battle made worse by visibility so poor that friends fired on friends, and enemies killed enemies by accident rather than design. In such conditions, victory went to the army with the strongest leadership and the clearest sense of purpose. Warwick, fighting on foot in the old manner to show his men that he would share their fate whatever the outcome, died as he had lived, surrounded by enemies, refusing to yield, his sword in his hand and defiance on his lips. The man who had been called the Kingmaker met his end in the mud of Barnet Field, struck down by weapons wielded by soldiers whose fathers had once served under his banner. His death marked not just the end of a remarkable career, but the conclusion of an entire era in English politics, the last time that a subject could challenge royal authority through feudal might and expect to succeed. The Battle of Tewkesbury, fought on May 4, 1471, completed Edward's restoration and dealt the final blow to Lancastrian hopes that had survived 3 decades of defeat and exile. The Abbey Meadows beside the River Severn, where Queen Margaret had made her last desperate stand with an army gathered from French allies and Welsh sympathisers, became the graveyard of the red rose that had once seemed destined to bloom forever in English royal gardens. Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian prince whose marriage to Anne Neville had sealed the impossible alliance between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, died in the battle or immediately afterward. The historical records are deliberately vague about whether he fell in combat like a soldier or was murdered in cold blood like a criminal. His death ended the direct Lancastrian line and removed the last credible alternative to Yorkist rule, transforming Edward IV from successful usurper into legitimate king through the brutal arithmetic of dynastic warfare. Queen Margaret's capture after Tewkesbury marked the end of one of the most remarkable careers in medieval politics. The French princess who had tried to be the man her gentle husband could never become, who had led armies and planned battles and schemed with foreign powers for the restoration of her son's inheritance, spent her final English years as a prisoner whose very survival was a courtesy her captors could revoke at will. When she was finally ransomed back to France, she left behind a kingdom that had been transformed by her 30 years of struggle against fate and fortune. The mysterious death of Henry VI in the Tower of London on the night of May 24-22, 1471, officially from melancholy but widely suspected to be from more direct causes, removed the last impediment to Edward's unchallenged rule. The saintly king who had never wanted his throne but could never fully abandon it, found the peace in death that had always eluded him in life, his passing marked by miracles that his supporters claimed as evidence of divine favour, but his enemies dismissed as wishful thinking by the credulous and defeated. With the deaths of Warwick, Edward of Westminster, and Henry VI, the Wars of the Roses seemed finally to have reached their conclusion. Edward IV, at 31, had eliminated every rival claimant to his throne and destroyed every noble family that had challenged his authority. The kingdom that had been torn apart by civil war for 16 years could finally turn its attention from the grim business of survival to the more pleasant tasks of recovery and prosperity. The warrior king who had won his crown through military genius now had the opportunity to prove whether he could keep it through the more subtle arts of peaceful government. The England that emerged from the smoke and blood of Tewkesbury Field was like a garden after a long, harsh winter, ready to bloom again under the warming sun of effective royal government and the gentle rains of returning prosperity. Edward IV, now securely established on his throne with no credible rivals left alive to challenge his authority, devoted his remarkable energy and intelligence to the peacetime arts of kingship with the same systematic approach that had made him victorious in war. Picture London in the middle years of Edward's reign, the Thames crowded with merchant ships whose holds carried wool to Flanders and brought back the fine cloth and luxury goods that indicated a kingdom growing wealthy again. The Steelyard, where German merchants from the Hanseatic League conducted their business, buzzed with activity as trade routes that had been disrupted by decades of civil war reopened under the protection of a king who understood that royal strength ultimately depended on commercial prosperity. The sound of hammers rang from workshops where craftsmen laboured to supply the demands of customers who could once again afford to think beyond mere survival. Edward's court became a mirror of this renewed prosperity, attracting scholars, artists, and musicians from across Europe to a kingdom that had rediscovered its appetite for learning and beauty. The king himself, whose education had been interrupted by the demands of warfare, proved to be a sophisticated patron of the arts with particular interest in the new technology of printing that William Caxton introduced to England in 1476. The first books printed in English included works that Edward personally commissioned, demonstrating that the warrior who had triumphed through violence now sought to be remembered for his contributions to civilization. The Royal Library at Westminster Palace grew to become one of the finest in Europe, its shelves lined with manuscripts and printed books that covered subjects ranging from classical philosophy to contemporary chronicles of the civil wars that had finally ended. Edward spent long hours in this sanctuary, his tall frame bent over texts that helped him understand not just the technical aspects of government, but the deeper principles that separated legitimate kingship from mere successful tyranny. Foreign ambassadors reported with surprise that the English king could discuss Aristotle's politics as knowledgeably as he could plan a military campaign. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, which had caused such political controversy in its early years, evolved into a partnership that provided the kingdom with the precious gift of dynastic stability. The royal nurseries at Westminster and Windsor echoed with the voices of healthy children whose very existence promised that England would not again face the succession crises that had precipitated the Wars of the Roses. Prince Edward, born in 1470, grew into a precocious boy whose intelligence and charm suggested that he had inherited the best qualities of both his parents, while his younger brother Richard and their sisters provided additional security for the royal line. The legal reforms implemented during Edward's second reign demonstrated that the king understood governance as something more complex than the mere exercise of royal will. The courts that had functioned sporadically during the worst years of civil war now operated with efficiency and fairness that earned the grudging respect even of those who had opposed Edward's rise to power. The king's personal involvement in judicial matters — he often presided over important cases himself — showed his subjects that royal justice was more than an abstract concept dispensed by distant functionaries. Edward's financial policies revealed the mathematical intelligence that had made him a successful military commander. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied on parliamentary grants and forced loans to fund their governments, Edward achieved something approaching fiscal independence through careful management of crown lands, shrewd commercial investments, and diplomatic policies that avoided the ruinous expenses of foreign wars. The royal treasury, which had been empty for most of Henry VI's reign, accumulated reserves that allowed Edward to govern without constantly begging his subjects for money, an achievement that enhanced royal dignity while reducing political friction. The rebuilding of England's military reputation proceeded alongside these domestic improvements. Edward's decision to avoid major continental commitments while maintaining a small but professional army meant that England's neighbours learned to respect her potential for military action without being threatened by aggressive policies that might provoke defensive coalitions. The English archers, whose prowess had been demonstrated at Towton, Barnet and Tewkesbury, served as a deterrent that made diplomacy more effective than it had been when backed only by Henry VI's gentle protestations of peaceful intent. Trade flourished under Edward's protection in ways that benefited merchants and craftsmen throughout the kingdom. The merchant adventurers, those bold entrepreneurs who carried English wool to continental markets and brought back the profits that enriched entire regions, found their activities supported by royal policies that understood commerce as the foundation of national strength. The great ports of London, Bristol and Hull hummed with activity as ships arrived daily carrying goods from places that had been cut off from English trade during the worst years of civil war. Religious life, too, experienced a renaissance under Edward's patronage. The king's personal piety, while less ostentatious than Henry VI's saintly devotions, expressed itself through support for architectural projects that beautified the realm, while providing employment for craftsmen whose skills had nearly been lost during the years of warfare. The chapel of St. George at Windsor, completed during Edward's reign, stands today as a monument to the artistic achievement that peaceful government made possible. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, thoughtful observers might have detected signs that the foundations of Edward's success were not as solid as they appeared. The king's growing fondness for the pleasures that peace and prosperity made possible, rich food, fine wine, and the company of beautiful women, was beginning to affect the magnificent physique that had been one of his greatest assets during his years as a warrior. By his 40th birthday, Edward had grown stout in the manner of successful medieval kings, his golden hair thinning and his face showing the effects of a lifestyle that valued immediate pleasure over long-term health. More ominously, the very success of Edward's reign had created new problems that his military victories could not solve. The great noble families that had survived the civil wars, the Howards, Percys and Stanleys, had used the years of peace to rebuild their strength and nurse ambitions that a strong king could contain. but might not be able to eliminate permanently. The royal brothers, George Duke of Clarence and Richard Duke of Gloucester, had grown into men whose loyalty to Edward was genuine, but whose own ambitions might prove problematic if the kingdom ever again faced the uncertainties of a disputed succession. As the 1470s gave way to the 1480s, Edward IV could look back on a decade of achievement that had transformed England from a war-torn kingdom into a prosperous and respected European power. The king, who had won his throne through military genius, had proven equally capable at the subtler arts of peacetime government, giving his subjects the stability and prosperity that had been denied to their parents and grandparents during the long years of civil strife. The death of Edward IV, on April 9, 1483, struck England like a thunderbolt from a clear spring sky, transforming in a single moment a kingdom that had grown comfortable with strong royal leadership into a realm suddenly vulnerable to all the ambitions and uncertainties that effective monarchy had kept carefully suppressed. The king, who had seemed as permanent as the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey, was gone at 50 years of age, worn out by the pleasures of peace, as surely as other kings had been destroyed by the rigours of war, leaving behind two young sons whose very innocence would prove their destruction. Picture the scene at Westminster Palace when the news of the king's death spread through chambers that had echoed with his confident voice just days before. Courtiers gathering in small groups to whisper about the future, servants continuing their daily tasks with the mechanical efficiency that habit provides when the mind is too stunned to think clearly, and over everything the terrible silence that follows when a great voice is suddenly stilled forever. The 12-year-old boy, who was now Edward V, had been at Ludlow Castle, learning the arts of governance under the guidance of his maternal uncle, Earl Rivers, when messengers brought word that his childhood was over and his reign had begun. The journey from Ludlow to London should have been a triumphant procession, the new king travelling through his realm to claim the crown that was his birthright, while subjects lined the roads to cheer their young sovereign. Instead, it became a chess game played with living pieces, as the great lords who had served Edward IV manoeuvred to secure their positions in the new order, while the boy at the centre of their calculations remained largely unaware that his fate was being decided by men whose loyalty was tempered by self-interest and shaped by ambitions that his father's strong hand had kept carefully controlled. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had received word of his brother's death while governing the northern counties from his seat at Middleham Castle, where the harsh beauty of Yorkshire landscape had shaped him into a man as different from the genial Edward IV as winter differs from summer. Picture Richard in those crucial days following the king's death, a slight figure whose dark hair and pale complexion made him appear older than his 30 years, his intelligence sharpened by physical frailty into something approaching genius, and his loyalty to his dead brother warring with his growing conviction that the kingdom required stronger hands than a child's to guide it through the dangerous waters ahead. The confrontation at Stony Stratford, where Richard intercepted the party bringing young Edward V to London, marked the beginning of the end for the Woodville family's hopes of maintaining their influence during the new reign. Earl Rivers and Sir Richard Grey, the boy king's half-brother, found themselves arrested on charges of treason that were legally questionable but politically decisive, their removal from Edward V's council clearing the way for Richard to assume the role of protector that Parliament would soon formalise. The 12-year-old king, witnessing the arrest of men he had trusted and loved, received his first lesson in the brutal realities of power politics that his father had shielded him from understanding. London in the spring of 1483 buzzed with rumours and speculation as the great lords of the realm gathered for the coronation that everyone expected and the political manoeuvring that everyone feared. The Tower of London, where kings traditionally resided before their crowning, welcomed Edward V with all the ceremony due to an anointed sovereign, yet thoughtful observers might have noticed that the royal apartments felt more like a prison than a palace, their comfort undermined by the knowledge that guests could not leave without their host's permission. Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, joined his brother in the Tower in June 1483, officially to provide companionship during the lonely weeks before the coronation, but actually to ensure that both potential claimants to the throne remained under Gloucester's control. Picture the two boys in their comfortable apartments, Edward I trying to maintain the dignity expected of a king while struggling with fears he was too young to fully understand, and 9-year-old Richard playing with toys that would soon be put away forever, unaware that he was living through the last weeks of childhood innocence that his family name would ever know. The revelation of the alleged illegitimacy of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the legal foundation for Richard III's claim to the throne, came through Dr. Ter, Ralph Shah's sermon at Paul's Cross on June 22, 1483. The learned doctor, speaking to a crowd that had gathered expecting routine religious instruction, instead heard arguments that their late king's marriage had been invalid, his children therefore bastards, and Richard of Gloucester consequently the rightful heir to the crown. The legal reasoning was complex, involving Edward IV's alleged pre-contract to Eleanor Butler, but the political reality was simple. Richard possessed the power to enforce his claim, and power had always been the ultimate arbiter of royal legitimacy in medieval England. The coronation of Richard III on July 6, 1483, was magnificent in all its external aspects. The ancient ceremonies performed with meticulous attention to detail, the great lords of the realm kneeling in homage to their new sovereign, the crowds that cheered because that was what crowds were expected to do when kings were crowned. Yet beneath the pageantry lay an uneasiness that no amount of ceremony could dispel. The knowledge that this coronation had been made possible only by declaring two innocent children illegitimate and removing them from the succession they had been born to inherit. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's most haunting mysteries, shrouded in the kind of deliberate obscurity that powerful men create when their actions cannot bear close examination. The boys were seen less and less frequently in the Tower's gardens as the summer of 1483 progressed, their faces disappearing from the windows where London citizens had grown accustomed to glimpsing them at play. By autumn, they had vanished entirely, their absence explained by increasingly implausible official stories that fooled no one but could not be openly challenged by subjects who valued their own lives. Sir James Tyrrell's later confession to their murders, extracted under circumstances that make its reliability questionable, provided the Tudor historians with a narrative that served their political needs while obscuring the truth that might have been inconvenient for all concerned. Whether the princes died by Richard's direct order, through the unauthorized actions of overzealous subordinates, or from natural causes that their enemies chose not to investigate too closely, their disappearance from history marked the moment when medieval England lost whatever remained of its political innocence. The reaction of ordinary people to the princes' disappearance revealed the depth of horror that their fate inspired in subjects who had grown inured to political violence, but could not accept the deliberate targeting of children for dynastic advantage. In taverns and marketplaces, in manor houses and monastery cloisters, English men and women spoke in whispers about the empty Tower windows and wondered what kind of kingdom they now inhabited, where royal blood provided no protection against royal ambition and innocence itself had become a capital crime. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, the boy's mother, had sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey when Richard's intentions became clear, but no sanctuary could protect her from the knowledge of what had happened to her sons. The woman who had risen from minor gentry to become Queen of England through a love match that had seemed like a fairy tale discovered that fairy tales, when they intersect with the harsh realities of political power, usually end in tragedy rather than happiness. The disappearance of the princes created a void in English political consciousness that would haunt Richard III's reign from beginning to end. The king who had claimed the throne to prevent the dangers of minority rule found that his very success in eliminating those dangers had created new problems that were ultimately more dangerous than the ones he had solved. The whispered questions about the prince's fate undermined the legitimacy that Richard had sought to establish through legal argument and parliamentary approval, creating a reservoir of guilt and suspicion that his enemies could tap whenever they needed popular support for rebellion. As autumn gave way to winter in 1483, and the Tower of London stood silent beneath grey December skies, thoughtful observers might have wondered whether the kingdom that had endured 30 years of civil war was finally at peace, or whether the disappearance of 2 innocent children had planted seeds of vengeance that would bloom into new conflicts more terrible than any that had come before. The Wars of the Roses, which had seemed to end with Edward IV's victories, were about to enter their final and most bitter phase, fought not for competing claims to legitimate authority, but for the more fundamental question of whether England would be governed by men who respected moral boundaries or by those who recognised only the law of success. Richard III ascended to the throne of England on July 6, 1483, amid all the pageantry that medieval tradition could provide. Yet his coronation felt more like a funeral than a celebration to many who witnessed it, as if the ancient kingdom was burying its last pretense of innocence along with crowning its most controversial king. Picture that scene in Westminster Abbey, the same hallowed stones that had witnessed the crowning of 34 previous monarchs, now echoing with prayers and hymns that seemed to carry an undertone of desperate hope rather than confident celebration. While outside the Abbey walls, London crowds cheered with the mechanical enthusiasm of subjects who had learned that survival required the appearance of loyalty regardless of private doubts. The new king brought to his impossible task gifts that would have served him well in any role except the one fate had thrust upon him. Richard possessed an administrative competence that had made him an effective ruler of northern England during his brother's reign, a genuine concern for legal reform that expressed itself in practical measures to protect ordinary subjects from exploitation, and a personal courage that had been proven on battlefields from Barnet to Tewkesbury. What he lacked, and could never acquire, was the one quality medieval kingship required above all others, the ability to make his subjects believe in his right to rule them. The legislation passed during Richard's brief reign revealed a mind genuinely concerned with the welfare of subjects who had too often been exploited by those in authority over them. The Act regulating trade practices, the measures protecting accused criminals from excessive bail, and the efforts to reform the legal system showed that Richard understood governance as something more than the mere exercise of power for personal advantage. Foreign visitors to his court noted with surprise that the usurper king seemed more concerned with justice than with the aggrandizement that usually marked the reigns of men who had seized power through questionable means. Yet every beneficial law that Richard signed, every wise decision he made, every demonstration of his competence as a ruler, served only to deepen the central tragedy of his position, that his undoubted abilities as a king could not overcome the circumstances through which he had gained his crown. The very efficiency of his government reminded his subjects daily that such qualities could have been exercised in his brother's service without requiring the removal of 2 innocent children from the line of succession, and that competence gained through such means might prove more dangerous than the familiar incompetence they had learned to tolerate. The rebellion of the Duke of Buckingham in the autumn of 1483 demonstrated how quickly the foundations of Richard's authority could crumble when tested by serious opposition. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, had been one of Richard's most important supporters during his seizure of power, and his defection suggested that even those who had helped create the new regime were beginning to question whether they had chosen the right side in the struggle between legitimacy and efficiency. Picture Buckingham in his castle at Brecon, surrounded by Welsh hills that had sheltered rebels against English authority for centuries, contemplating the messages that had begun arriving from Henry Tudor's agents in Brittany, and realizing that the king he had helped to crown might not survive the consequences of his own success. The failure of Buckingham's rebellion, due largely to flooding that prevented his Welsh supporters from joining him in time, provided Richard with a temporary reprieve, but could not solve the fundamental problem that haunted his reign, like a curse that grew stronger with each passing day. The Duke's execution at Salisbury in November 1483 eliminated one immediate threat, but created new fears among other nobles, who wondered whether their own loyalty would be sufficient protection if Richard's suspicions were aroused by circumstances beyond their control. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne, viewed objectively, was almost laughably weak. His connection to royal blood traced through his mother's descent from John of Gaunt's illegitimate children, a genealogical thread so thin that it would have been dismissed without serious consideration in normal times. But the summer of 1485 was not normal times, and the young exile's very obscurity became an advantage in a kingdom that had grown weary of dramatic personalities and sensational events. Picture Henry in the court of Charles VIII of France, a pale, careful young man whose 28 years had been spent mostly in exile, learning statecraft through observation rather than practice, and understanding that his greatest asset was not any personal quality, but simply the fact that he was not Richard III. The invasion of 1485 began almost casually, with Henry's small fleet landing at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire on August the 7th, with fewer than 2,000 men, many of them French mercenaries whose loyalty extended only as far as their pay. The force that disembarked on that Welsh beach seemed pathetically inadequate to challenge an established king who commanded the resources of an entire kingdom, yet the very modesty of Henry's invasion made it less threatening than a larger force might have been to nobles who were still calculating which side offered the better prospects for survival and advancement. The march across Wales became a test of Richard's support that revealed how hollow his apparent authority had become in the 2 years since his coronation. Welsh gentlemen, who might have been expected to resist foreign invasion, instead joined Henry's growing army, drawn partly by his Welsh ancestry through his grandfather Owen Tudor, but mainly by their assessment that Richard III's reign was approaching its natural end, and that survival required choosing the winning side before the final battle was fought. Richard's response to the invasion showed both his personal courage and his political isolation. The king, who had once been his brother's most trusted lieutenant, threw himself into military preparations with the desperate energy of a man who understood that his entire future depended on a single battle, yet his summons for support met with responses that ranged from cautious compliance to outright refusal. The great lords of England, who had learned during 40 years of civil war to evaluate their options carefully before committing themselves irrevocably to any cause, watched and waited to see how the campaign would develop before deciding whether their loyalty belonged to the anointed king or to the invading exile. The final weeks before Bosworth were filled with negotiations, betrayals, and calculations that would have done credit to the most complex diplomatic conference, as both sides sought to secure advantages that might prove decisive when words finally gave way to weapons. Richard understood that his survival depended not just on military victory, but on demonstrating to his subjects that divine providence still favoured his cause, while Henry needed to prove that his invasion represented not foreign conquest, but English liberation from tyrannical rule. As August gave way to the final days before battle, Richard III must have reflected on the strange turns of fortune that had brought him from his brother's loyal service to this desperate gamble with destiny. The man who had spent his adult life defending the Yorkist dynasty against all enemies now found himself fighting for its survival against a challenger whose greatest qualification was the promise that his victory would end the uncertainties and moral compromises that Richard's reign had embodied. The last Plantagenet king prepared to stake everything on a single afternoon's work, understanding that defeat would mean not just his death, but the extinction of a royal line that had ruled England for more than 3 centuries. In the quiet hours before dawn on August the 22nd, 1485, as Richard knelt in his pavilion and offered what might prove to be his final prayers, the king who had gained his crown through questionable means prepared to defend it through unquestionable courage, knowing that history would judge him not by his intentions but by his success or failure in the test that awaited him at Bosworth Field. The dawn of August 22nd, 1485, rose grey and misty over the Leicestershire countryside, where dew clung to spiderwebs stretched between the gorse bushes, and early morning birds called tentatively from hedgerows that had no knowledge they were about to witness the end of medieval England. Picture that landscape in the pale light of early morning, rolling hills that seemed designed by Providence for agriculture rather than warfare, their gentle slopes dotted with the sheep that had made English wool the envy of Europe, and over everything the kind of peaceful silence that makes violent death seem not just tragic but almost sacrilegious. Richard III had chosen his position with the practiced eye of a soldier who understood that terrain could be as important as courage in determining the outcome of battles. Ambion Hill provided his forces with the advantage of higher ground, while the marshy areas to his front would force Henry Tudor's advancing army to attack uphill through difficult terrain that would disorganize their ranks and expose them to the kind of concentrated arrow storms that had made English archery famous from Crecy to Agincourt. The king's battle plan was sound, his position strong, and his forces numerically superior to the invading army that had landed in Wales just 2 weeks earlier. Yet Richard understood, as all experienced commanders did, that battles were won not just by tactics and terrain, but by the willingness of ordinary soldiers to die for their leaders' causes, and on that August morning he could sense in his men's faces the same uncertainty that had plagued his reign from its beginning. The royal army that deployed across Ambion Hill included many veterans who had fought under the Yorkist banners at Towton and Tewkesbury, men whose loyalty to the House of York was genuine and deep, but it also included contingents led by nobles whose commitment to Richard's cause remained questionable right up to the moment when steel would begin to clash against steel. Henry Tudor's army, advancing through the morning mist like ghosts materializing from the grey landscape, seemed almost pitifully small compared to the royal host waiting on the hill above them. Picture Henry himself in those final moments before battle, a slight figure in armour that had been made for him by French smiths, his pale face showing the strain of 2 weeks campaigning through hostile territory, yet his dark eyes reflecting a calm determination that suggested he understood his role in the great drama about to unfold. At 28, Henry possessed none of the obvious qualifications for kingship that medieval ideals demanded. He was not a proven warrior, not a charismatic leader, not even particularly impressive in appearance. Yet he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who believed that Providence had preserved him through long years of exile for this specific purpose. The battle began with the traditional exchanges of archery that had opened English conflicts for generations, but the thick morning air robbed the arrows of much of their effectiveness, and both armies soon found themselves committed to the hand-to-hand combat that would determine which claimant deserved to wear the crown of England. In the centre of the field, where Henry's main force clashed with Richard's household troops, the fighting took on the brutal, methodical character that marked medieval warfare at its most professional level. Men in steel armour hammering at each other with weapons designed to penetrate mail and plate. The outcome decided not by dramatic gestures but by superior conditioning, better equipment, and the kind of grim determination that came from understanding that defeat meant death. But the real drama of Bosworth was being played out on the flanks, where the loyalty of key commanders would prove more decisive than the courage of ordinary soldiers. Thomas Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William, whose forces held positions that could intervene decisively for either side, had spent the night before the battle in careful negotiation with both armies, their final decision dependent on their assessment of which claimant offered the better prospects for survival and advancement. The Stanley brothers understood, as successful medieval politicians always did, that backing the wrong side in a dynastic conflict was a mistake that few families survived, and their calculation of the odds would ultimately determine whether England's next king would be called Richard III or Henry VII. The Earl of Northumberland, commanding Richard's reserve, made his own calculation and chose to keep his forces inactive during the crucial moments of battle, neither supporting his royal master nor openly defecting to Henry Tudor, but simply waiting to see how events would develop before committing himself irrevocably to either cause. This cautious neutrality, while perhaps prudent from Northumberland's personal perspective, left Richard without the reserves he needed to exploit his initial advantages, and forced the king to recognise that his own personal prowess would have to compensate for the political weakness that had plagued his reign from its beginning. Richard III's final charge became the stuff of legend even before the battle was over, transforming a failed political calculation into the kind of heroic gesture that medieval chroniclers loved to record for posterity. Picture the king in that moment when he realised that victory could only come through personal action, spurring his great warhorse down the slope of Ambion Hill directly toward Henry Tudor's position, his sword raised above his head, his voice carrying across the battlefield as he shouted his battle cry, and behind him, a small group of household knights whose loyalty had never wavered despite all the doubts and compromises that had marked their master's reign. The charge nearly succeeded through sheer audacity and Richard's considerable skill as a warrior. The king's sword cut down Henry's standard-bearer and came within yards of reaching Henry himself, before the weight of numbers and the intervention of Sir William Stanley's fresh troops finally overwhelmed the royal party. Richard died as he had chosen to live during his brief reign, fighting against odds that would have daunted a more cautious man, refusing to yield or flee even when defeat became inevitable, and demonstrating through his final moments that whatever his faults as a king, his courage as a man had never been in question. The discovery of Richard's body on the battlefield, stripped of its armour and dignity by soldiers who understood that dead kings had no power to punish disrespect, marked the end not just of a reign, but of an entire dynasty that had ruled England since 1154. The crown that had been Richard's for just 2 years was found in a thorn bush, according to legend, and placed on Henry Tudor's head by Lord Stanley in a ceremony that was both coronation and political calculation, the symbolic beginning of a new era that would be built on the grave of the old. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth was complete in ways that transcended mere military success. The death of Richard III eliminated not just a rival claimant, but the last representative of the Plantagenet tradition of warrior kingship that had shaped English political culture for over 3 centuries. The new king who emerged from the morning mist to claim his crown represented something fundamentally different. A ruler whose authority would rest not on feudal loyalty or military prowess, but on administrative competence and the careful management of noble ambitions that had proven too powerful for traditional monarchy to control. The aftermath of Bosworth revealed how thoroughly the old order had been overthrown, along with Richard III. The great noble families that had dominated English politics since the Norman conquest found themselves forced to seek accommodation with a king whose power came not from ancient bloodlines but from successful rebellion, and whose vision of monarchy emphasized bureaucratic efficiency over chivalric gesture. The England that had produced the Black Prince and Henry V, Edward III, and Richard the Lionheart was giving way to a more modern state where accountants would prove more valuable than knights and diplomacy more effective than warfare. As the sun set on August 22, 1485, over a battlefield where ravens gathered to feast on the remnants of medieval England's last great dynastic war, thoughtful observers might have sensed that they were witnessing not just the end of the Wars of the Roses, but the conclusion of an entire chapter in their nation's history. The Wheel of Fortune had completed another of its great revolutions, carrying down the last of the Plantagenet kings and raising up the first of the Tudors, while somewhere in the gathering darkness, the future was already beginning to take shape in ways that none of the day's participants could have imagined. And so, the great Wheel of Fortune, which had turned so violently through 30 years of English civil war, finally came to rest in the mud of Bosworth Field, where the last Plantagenet king surrendered his crown and his life to a future he could not control and a destiny he had never sought. Picture those battlefields now, 6 centuries later, peaceful farmland where sheep graze over ground that once soaked up royal blood, their bells jingling softly in afternoon breezes that carry no echoes of ancient war cries or dying kings' final prayers. The Wars of the Roses, which had begun with such modest bloodshed at St. Modest, Albans, and escalated through decades of increasing brutality, left behind an England transformed in ways that extended far beyond the simple question of which family would occupy the throne. The great noble houses that had torn the kingdom apart, the Nevilles and Percys, Beauforts and Staffords, lay broken by the conflicts they had helped create, their power scattered like autumn leaves before the winter winds of political change. In their place arose a new kind of government, one that would depend more on professional administrators than feudal warriors, more on careful diplomacy than battlefield courage. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York in January 1486 united the White Rose and the Red in a ceremony that was both wedding and peace treaty, binding together the surviving remnants of 2 dynasties that had learned through bitter experience that their mutual destruction served neither family's interests nor England's welfare. Their children would grow up in a kingdom that had forgotten the arts of civil war and turned its attention to exploration, trade, and the intellectual achievements that would make Tudor England one of Europe's greatest powers. The legal and constitutional changes that grew from the Civil War's ashes proved more lasting than any of the military victories that had seemed so decisive at the time. The principle that kings ruled by consent as well as birth, that subjects possessed rights that even royal authority could not arbitrarily violate, and that effective government required the cooperation of ruler and ruled. These ideas, tested in the crucible of dynastic warfare, would eventually flower into the parliamentary democracy that became England's greatest gift to the modern world. Walk today through the quiet gardens where white roses and red roses bloom together in gentle harmony, their petals falling on paths trod by tourists who come to glimpse the past that shaped their present. The castles where great lords once plotted kingdoms' destruction now shelter peaceful museum displays, their stones warmed by summer sunshine, their silence broken only by children's laughter and the distant sound of traffic carrying ordinary people about their daily business. The England that emerged from the Wars of the Roses had learned that ambition unchecked by wisdom leads to destruction, that power without consent cannot long endure, and that even the mightiest dynasties must eventually bow before the judgment of time. These lessons, written in the blood of kings and commoners alike, echo still in the institutions that govern modern democracies and the principles that protect individual liberty against the age-old temptation of absolute power. Sleep now, and let these ancient stories carry you gently toward rest, knowing that from humanity's darkest chapters often come its brightest dawns, and that the roses bloom most beautifully in soil, enriched by the sorrows of those who came before.